Hi. I wanted to talk to you today about um, a poem or prose piece by William S. Burroughs called Apocalypse, and why it's a good piece to learn from. In the last 5 videos, I've had animals getting in the way of the camera, and right away Maggie just decided to jump on my lap and get in the way of the camera, and now get into my face. She can't stand not being in between the camera and me. Um, so there we go. Okay. Um, there she goes. Okay. So Apocalypse by William S. Burroughs. It's a good piece that I quote all the time just to explain some basic concepts. Um, a lot of the reason I'm um, making these videos, the last one I did was about 80s movies, and I just happened to be wearing, I didn't even plan that. I happened to be wearing the Goonie shirt. Um, but the where was I? Apocalypse is a good one to quote, just to explain some of my favorite concepts. A lot of the reason I'm making these videos is to record some of my ideas about how stories work, in case I die any day now. Um, Very morbid reason um, to explain how stories work, in case I die. Um, but a lot of that came from just lack of fulfillment, or people telling me things that were just patently incorrect about how stories work, never really being able to find uh, creative writing textbooks or classes or anything like that that I actually agreed with. And a lot of the time I could just use Apocalypse as refutation. Here's why we'll never actually agree on how stories work. Here's Apocalypse by William S. Burroughs. But also, this is the 6th video, and I I have these weird superstitions. And superstition itself, just to foreground that, is a way of comforting people in the face of mystery. That's just the nature of superstitions. And I recognize that my weird superstitions are just comforting mechanisms, and that's it. So, I avoid things with the number 6 in them, or if a 6 comes up, I'll put, something dark or morbid, like the apocalypse, in the video. When I serialize stories on social media, the number 6 always has death in it. There's no good reason for that, but it's just comforting. And I think that's one of the really essential things to understand about how stories work, and the source of a lot of misconceptions is it functions the same as superstition, where a story or a piece of art or what have you presents the reader or the viewer with this mystery, and the power of it is in the mystery. But the power of it is in the mystery at the center. The power of it is in the mystery, the unexplainable mystery at the center. And the outer rim pulls the reader or the viewer away from the power of the unexplainable core elements, the churning emotional core elements. So there's that push and pull. That is how actually stories work, is you have that unexplainable core, or you have that churning emotional core. And so part of us is striving to move away from that mystery. And in real life, that could be unsettling. That could be, difficult to deal with in your daily life. And so, of course, you have comforting mechanisms, and they can be. I've talked about false dualism, but dualistic false universals, I think is what I call them. But they are designed for comfort. So a lot of our responses to, if a story has really effective mystery to it, a lot of our response is to default to these false universals in order to explain them, in order to comfort ourselves and not be stimulated by them anymore. That doesn't mean that that's what the story is actually about. That just means that's our response to it. Our response to it is to find a meaning, for example. And that's totally fine. Just like my silly superstitions, are for my own comfort. Anyone who explains my weird superstitions to me as being false, I recognize that consciously, but they're comforting. And I think a lot of defaulting to meaning in explanations of a story is specifically a comforting thing, a mechanism of our need for comfort in the face of discomforting. I say this as my dog, Siku, is extremely comfortable on the ground right now. But discomforting, mystery or emotion or what have you. So a lot of, if you're communicating a lot of emotions or you have, some sort of central mystery, the natural mechanism of the reader or the viewer is to explain it in some ways. And depending on what sort of effect you want, you can manipulate this response in order to heighten the effect of the core visceral image or mystery or story or what have you. Or you can undercut it, you can avoid it entirely. Or you can temper it in some way, so you can have some sort of metaphor in there as a way of tempering the intensity of the mystery or the intensity of the core visceral image or what have you, in order to communicate it more clearly. And at one point, I'm going to talk about my two favorite examples of that. Favorite meaning that they frustrate me. The Metamorphosis and Waiting for Godot. Which are commonly, the response to those two is to couch them in some sort of explanation in order to reduce the mystery. But anyway, that's for another video. I said I was going to talk about Apocalypse, but Apocalypse by William S. Burroughs, which was an audio recording, and you can call it a poem or prose piece. It's not exactly a story. It has some story elements, but it's not exactly a story. But I have it on my office door. I've had it there for years, for about 5 years now. Nobody's commented on how radically subversive it is, but the basic. So here's the part of it that I tend to quote most. Well, let me give a little preamble. Mariners sailing close to the shores of Tuscany, heard a voice calling out. I'm going to totally misquote it, I'm sure. Heard a voice calling out through the hills, the trees, and sky. The great god Pan is dead. Pan, god of panic. The sudden awareness that everything is alive and significant. The date, December 25th, 1 AD. And then there's more. He talks about the pipes of Pan and Shushuka, the Van Gogh's sunflowers writhing with pretentious life. Consider the apocalyptic statement. There we go. Consider the apocalyptic statement. Nothing is true and everything is permitted. Hasani Saba, the old man in the mountain. Not to be interpreted as an invitation to all manner of destructive behavior. I'm missing a word. Destructive behavior. That would be a minor incident which would run its course. Everything is permitted because nothing is true. It is all make-believe, dream, illusion, art. So, for the artist, I think the most effective, potent starting point is to recognize nothing is true, everything is permitted. And I think that was one of the biggest problems with the whole idea of instructing creative writing, is that if you go from a starting point of saying nothing is true, everything is permitted, that eliminates most of the basic mechanism of how people try to communicate what you should or shouldn't do in writing. Such and such is permitted, such and such is not permitted. Such and such is true, such and such is not true. That's a very dualistic way of thinking. But if you start from that basic point of saying nothing is true, everything is permitted, you still have a mechanism for taking that ultimate core. This is, sort of how this is a visualization. The core of pure, undifferentiated tissue. This is another image from another Burroughs piece. An undifferentiated tissue from which anything can grow. So, if nothing is true, everything is permitted. How do you take that everythingness, the everythingness with lack of restraint? How do you take that and form that into a story that is going to communicate that everythingness to somebody else? And that gives you infinite possibilities. The dualistic way of really communicating that is extremely limiting. And if you think of any sort of the cliched advice, like write what you know, which is my least favorite one, which is insidious anti-imaginative propaganda. Writing what you know is permitted. Writing what you don't know is not permitted, which is really, really bad advice. And I'm sure I'll make a whole video on that if I get around to it. Maybe the next one. Or just any little bit of advice. Show, don't tell. There's very dualistic. What is true is showing, or what is good is showing. What is bad is telling. Which is just not true. It's a mechanism that can help. It's, like I say, this is why the leech metaphor always comes up. It's, it's like I went to medical school and they taught how to use leeches. Leeches kind of work. Show, don't tell works, but does that mean it's always going to work? No, it's ridiculous to reduce communication about how stories work down to these pithy aphorisms that reduce it to what is permitted and what is not permitted, what is good and what is bad. If you break the artistic act down to that core of everything being permitted and everything being true, how do you take that and shape that? How do you, take a character and shape him or her into something that is able to take this churning cauldron of emotions and communicate it really effectively to someone without them shutting it down? And that's a good reason to understand how people shut it down. So if it's just purely chaotic, like if you read a Burroughs book, Burroughs books are very chaotic. So that is, an example of a story where everything is permitted within the story, nothing is true within the story, and it's this churning cauldron of images, and feelings and impulses and wackiness and all that sort of stuff. It works for certain audiences, but if you were to say, if you were to develop a set of rules that said, here's how structure works, any Burroughs book violates that. Here's how characters work. Any Burroughs book violates that. It violates pretty much every so-called rule because the rules are irrelevant. Rules are not a really good way of understanding how stories work just from the beginning. So to think of certain things being permitted is really, just at the base level is an incorrect way of really, it's ironically, it's an ineffective, let's say, way of even thinking about how art works from the beginning. But to think of, the forces really governing our experience of a piece. So to think of at the one end of the spectrum, you do have the more purely chaotic churning cauldron of images and impulses and what have you. And that is valid because that is effective for certain people on a purely subjective spectrum. That is an effective way of communicating visceral impulses to people. On the other end of the spectrum is a much more orderly, sort of rule-driven piece, and that is a totally valid, effective way of doing that. How do you optimize access to visceral impulses? How do you optimize access to that vicarious experiences of emotions without having the audience resist, the mechanisms of resistance of feeling these different impulses? How do you negotiate the two? And so teaching about how stories work has a lot more to do with the practice of negotiating those impulses pulling against each other than it has anything to do with any set of rules that apply to everyone, because that's just not how it works, or not how it should work. And I think that's about all I have to say for today. I knew this would be a short one. That's another thing about the weird superstitions. The timer is going to 16. There's another one. I'm just going to keep rambling until it goes to 17, just because it's comforting. There's a lot of terrifying and horrible things in the world. To feel like I have some sort of control is comforting, but as long as I recognize that that's the only reason I do it, is just because there are so many horrible, terrifying things in the world that I have no control over whatsoever. Let me have control over these few things. I'm able to recognize these things that I don't like, these entirely pointless things that I don't like. And I'm able to control them, and that gives me some sense of comfort. But a lot of things we take for granted as just being quote-unquote true about storytelling ultimately boil down to mechanisms of, similar sort of mechanisms of comfort, or mechanisms of, our feeling like we have some sort of control over something that we don't, or some sort of understanding of something where understanding is just not necessary. And look, it ticked over to 17. And my neurosis is now satisfied with being able to stop in this relatively short video. But say goodnight, Bo. Make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Smash that like button. I'll see you next time.